I again, in Christianity and anti-Christianity and their final conflict, Samuel Andrews is dealing with the change of the church's view on the relation between the church and the world, and how the kingdom view changed in specifically at the end of the 4th century, after Constantine Constantine and his successors had made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He says this change as to the time of the establishment of the kingdom and the belief in its administration by the church during the Lord's absence was most momentous, and brought with it many other changes, both as to belief and action. Some of these may be mentioned. First, the gradual forgetfulness of the promises of the Lord as to his speedy return, and the loss of faith in their fulfillment. In all his words to the disciples respecting his departure, he had encouraged them by this promise, and warned them not to be ensnared with worldliness, and forget to watch and pray for him. But all his commands and his admonitions to stand with loins girded, lamps burning, as servants waiting for their master, and the like admonitions of the apostles, were forgotten in their newly awakened expectation of the speedy triumph of the church. Gradually his return, instead of being an object of desire and thought of as near at hand, began to be regarded as far distant. If the church was commissioned by him to convert all nations and everywhere establish Christianity, a long period must necessarily elapse, and he would not come to cut her work short. As it was her commission not simply to preach the gospel of the kingdom, but to administer it, and to extend her authority over all nations, she must therefore address herself with all her powers to this work. Not until the world had been brought by her into obedience to Christ could he return to final judgment. Thus, instead of being kept always before the eye of the church as her head and Lord, guiding and directing all her activities, and whose return might be at any moment expected, he was withdrawn in good measure from her attention, as himself personally inactive. Having transferred authority to the church to set up the kingdom, it was inevitable that not what he was doing, but what the church was doing, should become the matter of chief interest to her members. Secondly, another consequence of this change of belief was that the church, in her effort to subdue the world, neglected her own spiritual culture and growth. The preparation of her children for her Lord's return, that they might be found of him in peace, without spot, and blameless, and enter with him into his glory, practically became of little moment, since that return was in the remote future. The great present interest, the paramount duty, was external, not internal, to gather new members and to make the nations Christian. As regarded individuals, the important thing was preparation for death, which must come soon and to all. Readiness for the change that would take place suddenly, in the twinkling of an eye, from mortality to immortality, a change that concerned the whole church, was no more thought of. The great point was not through fullness of spiritual life to hasten the coming of the Lord, and thus to escape death by translation, but to die individually in peace. Thus eschatology was narrowed to the act of death and the state of the disembodied. Thirdly, another consequence of the change of belief was the need early felt by the church of a human head. As has been said, the belief that the Lord had set one man as his vicar to rule for him was of slow growth, but naturally followed the loss of the expectation of his speedy return. In order that there might be unity of action in the great work of converting the nations, there must be unity of will in the church. And this could best be attained not under many bishops, but under one made ruler over all. The church, to administer the kingdom of the Lord effectually, must have an earthly head as his representative, one clothed with his authority. This idea, gradually taking possession of the mind of the church, found its realization in the Bishop of Rome. As Christ's vicar, the sphere of his rule must be as large as that of Christ, embracing not only those within the church, but all without it. His authority must also be higher than that of any earthly ruler, for as Christ is the King of kings and Lord of lords, so must be his vicar. This claim of the Roman bishop was indeed in some parts of the church long and strenuously resisted, and especially by kings and princes, but nevertheless a large part of Christendom, early saw in him the earthly head of the church, holding his place by divine appointment. Fourthly, still another consequence of this change of belief was the practical denial of the power of Satan as the prince of this world. The church could not deny his existence, for it had been most clearly testified to by the Lord and afterward by the apostles, nor could it be said that his power had been overthrown and that he was no longer to be feared. St. Paul had called him the god of this world in 2 Corinthians 4:4, and St. John had said, the world lieth in the wicked one. That's 1 John 5:19. In the Revelation, that is 12:3, he appears under the symbol of the dragon as the active enemy of God and of his Christ, and this down to the overthrow of the Antichrist until he himself is bound. But notwithstanding these explicit declarations and the continued recognition of various forms of satanic activity as regards individuals, the church early began to say, Satan no longer reigns. He's bound. He can offer no effectual opposition to our missionary activity and to our administration of the kingdom. There was little agreement, indeed, as to the time when he was bound, whether at the ascension of the Lord or after the empire became Christian. But the fact itself was accepted, for how could the kingdom of God be said to come and Christ to reign so long as Satan and his angels continued to have their former power in the earth? As no longer exposed to the attacks of this subtle and powerful adversary, no need was felt of special watchfulness. The strong man being bound, the church could securely spoil his goods. Being cast out of the earth, the church could take possession of it. Fifthly, another consequence of this change of belief was that as the earthly head of the church was exalted above all secular rulers, her bishops could take their places among the princes of the earth. The church had ceased to be a pilgrim and stranger. She was the bride of the ruler in heaven, exalted to sit with him in his throne. The world was to be subject to her, and therefore all distinctions and honors belonged to her leaders as the nobles of the king. Looking backward, we see how powerfully this conception of the present church period as the kingdom period, the time of Christ's rule administered by the church, has affected her whole internal history and her relations to the world. The Lord has passed gradually out of sight, hidden beneath her ministers and leaders elected by her, and practically deprived of his rule within her, and of his honor among the nations through the elevation of her Roman head. It may be said that no statesman of today thinks of taking the Lord personally into account in his plans for the future. Rulers rather ask in regard to their political movements, what will the Bishop of Rome or the clergy do? But who asks, what will Jesus Christ do? It is everywhere taken for granted among the nations that if indeed he exists and has all power, he has practically withdrawn from any active part in the government of the world. It need fear no interference on his part. He may come again in some remote future to be our judge, but now men are dealing with Christianity as an ethical system only. As to all practical matters of government, he is as if he personally did not exist. We may put into the mouths of most rulers of our day the words of the Israelites respecting Moses, absent in the mount. As for this man, we wot not what is become of him. That's the end of the chapter, relation of the church to the world. Next time he starts into tendencies in our day, preparing the way for the Antichrist. I'll put in a link to a video we did on the Matthew 16 account of Peter's confession and the subsequent rebuke he received from Jesus Christ. What was that all about? Well, it was about kingdom now. Peter had a version of the prosperity gospel. We are going to enter into glory right now because Messiah is here. And what did Christ say to him? Get behind me, Satan. So I'll put that video on your screen along with our pretty extensive kingdom playlist. See you next time.